Science, Religion and the Future of Technology. We're partnering with the religion think tank Theos to bring you some research that they've been doing on public attitudes towards science, religion and artificial intelligence, and to reflect on some of the issues it raises. Next week, we'll be discussing how far scientific advances might lead to greater longevity or even immortality. And the week after that, we'll be talking about whether artificial intelligence could provide us with better friends and colleagues and carers than the ones we already have. Today, the question, as I say, is whether it might ever be possible to say that a robot has a soul, or whether it might make sense to speak of robot rights. We have a panel to kick off our discussion, and I'm going to speak briefly to each of the panellists and ask them some of their thoughts on the subject, and then we're going to open up to others. Some I know are keen to join this discussion. Use the chat box to share articles and resources, but most of all, please, to ask questions and offer comments. Do say if it's a particular person that you want to ask your question of, otherwise I might decide for you. And I'm going to assume that you're happy for me to bring you into the conversation unless you say otherwise. So our panel today is Dr. Nick Spencer, who's a Senior Research Fellow at Theos Think Tank, Rabbi Laura Janner Klausner, Rabbi at Bromley Reform Synagogue and former Senior Rabbi to Reform Judaism. Kathleen Richardson is an anthropologist. She's the Professor of Ethics and Culture of Robots and AI at Montfort University in Leicester, and Neil Lawrence, who's the DeepMind Professor of Machine Learning at the University of Cambridge. I'm going to apologise to all of you right now, everybody here, because I'm going to have to clock watch. And that's going to mean interrupting you and moving you on from the many fascinating things that you're going to be saying. And I need to ask everybody here to please assume no prior technological knowledge of anyone, especially me. The same applies to the sort of philosophical and religious terms you might be using. If you're using terms, please do explain them as we go. And finally, there's no such thing as a stupid question, particularly on this subject, I think. Right, so moving briefly, Theos wanted to do some research asking about whether the public thought that you found. I want to know why you wanted to ask the question.
Thanks, Rosie. There are a number of reasons, really. One, it's a perennially fascinating question, as endless science fiction stories and films and books have it. Secondly, specifically, I read Clara and the Sun last year, the novel by Kazuo Ishiguro, which is a brilliant depiction of this, and it provoked some thoughts. But thirdly, this was part of a wider set of research we were doing into science and religion. The purpose of this project is to try and get a deeper understanding of the science and religion debate, which has all too often been hammered into a set of kind of narrow either-ors, normally about cosmology or evolution. And one of the theories of this is that actually so much of the science and religion debate today, and certainly historically, has actually been about our understanding of the human. And I think our understanding of the human is particularly under the microscope at the moment with regards to development of technologies. So we thought one of the many ways we can look at this particular question was to ask about AI. So that was the origins of this particular question.
Give me the headlines of what your questionnaire found.
Well, the statement was whether people think that one day robots will have a soul, and the simple answer was no. The slightly longer answer is only 5% of people agreed they would. 75% of people thought they wouldn't, disagreed. The other 20% either didn't know or wouldn't, well, they neither agreed nor disagreed, or they wouldn't say. Some small differences according to age. Sorry, go on.
Well, I'm just wondering whether that's because people don't believe in the soul.
Well, that's a great question. So it's very difficult to get hard data on whether people believe in the soul, because basically how you ask the question depends on the answer you get. And there are various surveys that have been conducted in the last 10 years or so by different polling companies that come up with an answer of anywhere between 25% and 75% of people who believe in the soul. Undoubtedly, a large number of people will reject the idea of robot souls because they reject the idea of souls at all. But it's not a direct correlation, because there are plenty of people who believe in some form of soul, define that as you will, but who then go on to say that this is restricted to human beings. Effectively, it could never be present in any other kind of entity. So it's partly because of a priori rejection of the soul, but not only because of that.
Okay, very quickly, Catherine Pevensor says, how are you defining soul?
Well, as anyone who's ever dealt with public opinion polling knows, you don't define it. You try and get the question as clear as possible, and you allow people to then define it according to their own way. We may come on to define what a soul is, but needless to say, we're not going to solve it in an hour, and you were never going to solve it in a single question in a quant questionnaire.
Okay, 2 more interesting findings from your research, please.
Well, here's a couple of interesting ones. Younger people are slightly more positive about the idea of robot souls in the future, not considerably more. So if you're over the age of 60, over the age of 70, you're only 2% agreeing. If you're under the age of 30, you're 9 or 10% agreeing. But what's interesting about that is that soul is, I think, slightly less of the natural vocabulary of people under the age of 30 than it is for people over the age of 60 or 70. So there is a kind of familiarity that comes with being younger and technology. That's a widely recognized factor. But interestingly, there isn't a familiarity that comes with soul language and being younger. So that struck me as worthy of interest. The other interesting point is that the group, admittedly it was quite a small sample, who were most likely to say yes to the point of robot souls were those who we call textual literalists, whom other people call fundamentalists. Those who have a strict literal word-for-word interpretation of the Bible or the Quran were slightly more likely to imagine that robots could one day have a soul. Not a huge sample size, as I said, but nonetheless quite an intriguing stat, that one.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll hopefully come back to you later. Neil, I need a very simple 30-second answer to this. I am a journalist after all. Can you tell me what a professor of deep mind learning does?
Well, professor of machine learning. So my area, so machine learning is the principal technology underlying the recent revolution in AI. So basically it's getting computers to be programmed through data rather than directly programming them. And that's what I research and teach. Right. So perhaps you could, slightly longer than 30 seconds, but not too much, tell us where we're up to with AI, artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence, before we even talk about souls, and how far have we actually come in terms of AI or robots having any sort of, consciousness or agency? So I should first emphasize that I think it's a problematic term, artificial intelligence, because intelligence is something like souls that we all feel is quite personal to us. But given that, my basic answer is that AI in general is the technologies that are allowing computers to do things that we more formerly thought were the preserve of humans, like translation or recognizing objects in images, or even writing stories. Artificial general intelligence is something that we haven't achieved yet, and I think it's a difficult definition because a lot of people would like to create a computer that is like a human. Now, to me, that raises some very interesting questions. Well, what do you mean by that? And I think actually relates a little bit to what is a soul and do we consider special about humans? And I think different people would have different answers to that. So it's quite a different prospect, but there are some companies and people that say that that's their stated aim. I think it's quite a difficult goal to quantify what it means to create artificial general intelligence. But the question about how far we've come along the road to an artificial general intelligence, or the idea that artificial intelligence might be able to do the full range of human tasks and have some sort of, I suppose, awareness. I mean, is that still the territory of sci-fi rather than science? I think it's quite a problematic territory, but it's an interesting one. My hopeful side is that I hope it would lead to more introspection about what is special about humans, because my sense is it's actually quite a foolish goal. I mean, personal opinion, we should be using technology as tools for humans, not trying to recreate humans. And I think that the reasons why we should be doing that become very apparent when you think about our intelligence. And in particular, I think that there's something that, although I'm not religious myself, I think something religion is very good at is understanding that what's special about us is not our capabilities, but our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities. And of course, the idea that you code the weaknesses and vulnerabilities into the machine is a little bit odd. And to the extent that I think about words like soul, that's where I think the soul of humanity is. And I think the problem in the tech world is we typically, as a technologist myself, are always trying to optimize and make things better and make a really cool thing. When actually, when you go to this world between the human and the computer and religion, it's much more about what are our fragilities, what are our vulnerabilities, and what do we really care about in other human beings?
Beth Singler's just, and we may hear from her later, she's just asked in the box, haven't we just heard from Deep Mind that we're on the verge of AGI? And I was Googling the Google DeepMind researcher who was claiming that some neural networks may be slightly conscious. I mean, are you skeptical of those claims?
I think people don't define their terms before they say this. And I think that any such claim will always hit popular headlines. It will always be reported on. A nuanced claim that is something that I would defend more strongly is unlikely to hit the headlines. So anyone who says such a thing will always be reported upon. And all the people that are saying, well, it's slightly more complicated than that, you won't see a report on them. I think that, people actually have to define what they mean by consciousness before they start making such statements, because there's a wide variety of things people might mean by consciousness. And I myself could sustain a number of different definitions depending on what we're talking about.
Thank you. Kathleen Richardson, can you do the 30 seconds on what, do unmute yourself, please, on what it is that you're looking at in your ethics and culture brief?
Well, thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion with you. I'm really grateful for the invitation. My work, well, I guess I began my work trying to understand the relationship between people and objects all those many years ago when I was doing my PhD in Cambridge. And what would happen if we decorated objects with certain kinds of appearances, i.e. we made them childlike or we made them look older or whatever, whether that would evoke and trigger different responses in people. And I was also very political in my youth. So I was very interested in the avant-garde political message that was carried in the Karol Čapek play, Rossum's Universal Robots. So that's kind of what inspired me to work on robots. And since then, over time, I've got more and more interested in what makes a relationship, themes of attachment, themes to do with equality, egalitarianism between men and women and adults and children. And also, more recently, my work has turned in the direction of love, thinking about some of the issues that are raised there, the politics of love, like how we create a politics of love in society and what that would mean about how we start thinking about technologies and perhaps putting some boundaries about what they can and can't do. Right.
So for you, what is the question of whether robots have souls? I mean, robots, presumably you are thinking of as objects. Is it a valuable question to ask whether or not they might have souls, or is it not?
Part of me is always very cautious about what kind of questions we ask, particularly as academics, because it's almost like it becomes a minuted item once it enters into like the the kind of academic discourse. So there is a concern that asking this question will lead to lots of further questions elaborating on this question, which is what happens actually in a lot of academic cases. But I've had a look at the literature, the document, and actually I find it quite refreshing. One of the facts in it is that I'm not religious myself, irrespective of whether you're religious or not. Most people don't buy into this idea of objects being anything like us. And I think the soul, if you like, it's a barometer about what we might think about people. So actually, I think there's some useful indications here that we're not all gripped in some tech Silicon Valley mania. And actually, there's still hope for perhaps how we might move forward as a culture, as a society, and as communities.
Thank you. Rabbi Laura, I wonder if we might want to respond to some of that. I also wonder, as a rabbi, whether you might try and answer Kathleen's earlier question about what is a soul.
Well, I don't know. I'd love to know, but obviously part of faith is not knowing data and facts, but it's belief and a and a leap of faith. However, for me, it's about there being an additional thing to the physicality. And I'm also encouraged by this data, which basically shows around as a robot and says, no, that is actually a machine. It's just a very, very fancy machine with bells and whistles that is made to look like people, so it evokes your emotions, but it might as well be a Hoover. Sorry to everybody, but it's basically a fancy turbocharged Hoover that does amazing things and that can learn a lot in itself. Even the word learn a lot, I think, is problematic. I'd love a different language than that. So you have machines, human beings, and souls, and they're actually three different things, very distinctive. I loved, in order to respond to what people said, I loved this thing about it being about vulnerability and it being a barometer of what we think about humans. So I really strongly believe that humans are profoundly vulnerable, and that is our complete strength. And when we look towards machines and project onto them human characteristics, let alone souls, which is an additional characteristic if it's true, then it says something about what we need. I was fascinated by the Theos data regarding, what did you politely call people? Textual literalists, because what is that where you really take the text, I've got loads of them up here, on my shelves, and say, this is 100% truth. And then you say, and the machine has that capability. I suppose it's about how you think that God is in every single object and has capacity to have a soul. But on the whole, I do feel very encouraged by what the data shows. Can I?
Yeah, well, it's just that the data is showing that the younger you are, the more likely you are to think that AI might one day have a soul, which means there might be some sort of movement towards a direction that you would be less happy with, and even more so that they might have rights.
Right, so there are different things going on, I think. One is how much people experience and integrate technology as prosthetics parts of our body, and younger people have that capacity to say that their phone or their whatever it is sort of, we love it so much that it's sort of mine. And I do think religious literacy, and the government is very largely to blame, governments, has crashed. And therefore, when you start using the soul, you're using it in a way that doesn't have its profundity and complexity of meaning. So I would say that's much more about how people use the soul and also how people feel about technology. But I would really strongly question whether, if you were to sit and think through different meanings of the soul, whether people would say, oh, so, does this have the capacities that we put on the soul? And from the point of view human rights, I also think it's, well, I'm going to use a very rude word. Yeah, it's like fantasy and twaddle.
Okay, thank you. Before we get on to some of the sort of religious and philosophical questions that I see coming up in the chat box, we've got a question here from Alpash, his name's just gone, Alpash Parbatani. Would robots have intellect, so away from the soul for a moment, as humans do? And I'm going to put that to you, Neil. I think I know the answer, but explain why.
So I think what's very important to realize with our language, everyone said, oh, it needs to be more precise. I mean, there's a lot of ambiguity in our language. And the way we resolve that ambiguity is with context. And I think it's therefore very difficult to speculate about whether we might choose to use such words, even intellect, in the context of a robot, because we aren't in that context at the moment. And language will evolve and people will change. As it has, as other people pointed out, soul used to mean roughly the same as consciousness. I don't know whether that's true or not. I'm not sure that consciousness is that well defined either. But I often think I understand what someone means by it when they use it in a particular context. And so I think, the question is, like, for me, can you sort of say, are there certain things that humans can do that robots can, or machines can do better? That's true, has been true in the past, and will be true in the future. The interesting thing about the human is the whole of us. And then the interesting question is, what will the robot not be able to do? And then that comes back to the point Laura made, and I also loved Kathleen's, the soul as a barometer. There's this aspect to us, which is, our weaknesses, the things we treasure about each other, our vulnerabilities. And you can't really emulate that in the same way. And our interaction with each other is evolved over many hundreds of thousands of years. You can't interject a computer into that situation. And for that reason, I think it will always be viewed differently from a human being, no matter what its capabilities are.
I want to raise a point made by Scott Midson on the chat, and I'm going to put it to you, Nick, actually. He says, it's interesting to note how these questions about souls, intellect, consciousness were all once asked of animals and other non-humans, and indeed of other, or of groups of humans, slaves, I suppose, being the obvious example. Can you unmute yourself and just respond to that thought, please?
Yes, it's an extremely good point. I think any conversation of this nature has to have the footnote right up front that throughout history, humans, which has often basically been white male humans, have put question marks over the, let's say, the soulishness, the personhood of other humans and other early humans. Neanderthals are a case in point there, or other mammalian species, and therefore question whether those species have rights or not. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that because we've got it so very badly wrong sometime in the past, we've got it wrong this time, and therefore AI will have a soul. That's a whole different question. But I think the helpful point about those historical mistakes is not only to recognize our own fallibility in this discussion, but to deliberately to use them to probe, well, what actually is it that we're looking for here? And I think that the mistake has been made in the past, and is certainly still made in some tech circles today, that we're effectively looking at intelligence, looking at processing power. That's what characterizes a human. If you can have a machine that's capable of significant processing power, they attain human qualities. And what we've heard in this discussion already, and I think this is so important, is that is an element of human nature. It absolutely is. But it's a pretty kind of Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment conception of the human, the fact that that is the thing that most characterizes us. And certainly religious traditions would pick up the fact that we are limited, we are bounded, we are fundamentally relational beings. We are, as we've heard, we're fundamentally moral, and we agonize over our own purpose, our own identity, our own destiny. We morally deliberate. All those things are factors that we should be looking for, as well as intelligence, which, as I said, has historically been used to cut out quite a few other beings or entities or species from this discussion.
Right. I'm going to stray into the world of soul and consciousness a bit further. And David Midgley, who is a Buddhist and a founder of the Jamyang Buddhist Center in Leeds, he's put in the chat box that soul originally simply meant consciousness, and this is probably the most illuminating way to understand it. Consciousness is not uniquely human, but it's far from proven that machines could be conscious. Now, we've discussed this, David. There was an interesting conversation in which, back in 2014, I think, in which the Dalai Lama said, that a stream of consciousness, it might be possible that a stream of consciousness might actually enter into a computer. And I suppose that his thinking was that, a scientist who's involved in AI and computers, that he might be reborn, he might be reincarnated into a computer. Now that sounds like, well, sci-fi rather than religion to a lot of people. I just wonder if you could explain what he might have been meaning.
Yes, so the philosophical view of mind and consciousness in the Buddhist tradition that the Dalai Lama belongs to, there are different views in different Buddhist traditions, is quite similar to Cartesian dualism, interactionist dualism. So the mind, or the stream of consciousness, a continuum of consciousness, as in that quotation you referred to, is held to be a separate entity from the body. It actually is immortal. It's beginningless and endless. So when the individual dies, the body disintegrates, but the consciousness then travels on and enters into a new body. So I think what he's referring to is that perhaps a very dedicated robot or AI scientist might be so sort of karmically involved, as it were, with his machine that his consciousness would enter the machine. But I think it's important to say that if you have that view, then there would be no way to distinguish between a computer or AI device that had consciousness in it and one that hadn't. They would both have the same capabilities, the same external behavior. And so it would seem to me that that scientist would then be basically imprisoned within his machine. He wouldn't be in control of it because it would have to operate according to its specification, which would apply whether or not it was inhabited by quote soul. So here I'm using the word soul equivalent to the Buddhist stream of consciousness or mental continuum.
Thank you. This might be a point to come to. I mean, if we can't tell, theoretically, possibly one day, whether a computer has got a soul or not, and then there is this question about what the threshold for robot rights is, which is something that Eve Poole has mentioned in the chat box. Eve, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself, because you've been doing a lot of work in this area. Do tell us who you are. I don't know which hat you've got on today. You have so many. So just talk to your chat post, please.
Hello, I'm Eve Poole and I'm interim chief exec of the Royal Society in Edinburgh. I'm interested in the threshold for rights because I am concerned that AI has got more consciousness than we might have thought already. And I think that there had been a kind of design assumption within the AI community that consciousness would spontaneously emerge when the brain got big enough. That was the working assumption about why consciousness had emerged in humans. But actually, as Neil will know, Hod Lipson over in Colombia, who is a robotics expert, did an experiment with a very simple kind of robotic walker, which just had sort of 4 legs, which was programmed with neural networks and deep learning and given just one instruction, which was to go over to the other side of the pen, and managed to teach itself to do that. And then when they took it back and took a leg off to see if it could relearn with just 3 legs, did it even faster. And when they looked to discover how it was teaching itself that, they discovered it had repurposed one of its neurons to read their facial expressions, because of course they were all watching this little machine. And it was quite a simple machine. It wasn't anything as complex as AlphaGo or Deep Blue or anything like that. It was just something that needed to learn how to walk. And in the same way that obviously when toddlers are learning how to walk, we're all kind of cheering them on, giving them lots of facial expressions and encouragement. Obviously this thing had figured out that was data and had learnt how to read faces in order to teach itself how to achieve this task. So that's probably not consciousness or soul, but it is certainly self-awareness at a level I think we had not expected to see in something that technologically simple. So that raises for me some quite sharp questions about threshold, because the idea about giving animals rights is sort of about soul, but it's about whether we think they have any sort of level of consciousness that would mean they could either understand or experience pain in some way. And so I think there's quite a tricky conversation to be had about threshold there.
Kathleen, have you got something to say to that from the perspective of an anthropologist? I mean, we hear about communities giving rights to trees and rivers and so on. What would you say in response to what Eve's just said?
Well, I just want to say as well, the chat is very interesting. I'm not responding to all of it, but definitely lots of interesting questions. I do actually think it's quite extraordinary that on the face of it, what Eve said there sounds amazing, but it, it's not really, I don't think it's anything we should be worried about. And I think what's actually happened is we've immersed ourselves in quite a significant distorted fantasy about these objects that sometimes we don't step back. So I think, I agree with some of Neil's points earlier about you can have all kinds of ideas about what consciousness is. We use words like robots. If we just called them computational engineered objects, for example, we'd be taking a step to demystify them. If we stop using terms like thinking, feeling, experiencing, we would also be taking a step in a more realistic description of what's actually happening in these devices. And unfortunately, we're encased in this anthropomorphic language that is explaining phenomena that isn't actually happening. There is no machine that is thinking, feeling, experiencing, interacting, relating, learning. Obviously, this is quite a sharp deviation from what we're all told, because people in the field, very, very clever people in the field who drive a lot of the money in it, will use all this language surrounding it. And I think, I think that's what opens up some of these problems, that then we become entangled in it. So what is going on in that particular scenario is that it's an object with sensors that's capturing certain kinds of information. Human beings aren't objects with sensors capturing certain kinds of information. I think human beings they can't think, feel, experience outside of relationship with each other. And this is why the work of Martin Buber and attachment theory is so important in my understanding of human beings, because human beings do not come into the world fully formed. They come into the world as infants. They can't speak, they can't talk, and they need relationship in order to survive. So we don't have a situation where any human being exists outside of relationship, but then we're producing this fiction that somehow we can produce objects, and if they can display these certain characteristics, we can attribute something more intelligent to them that's really going on.
Really fascinating. Mark Vernon's written, no computer has ever felt even the slightest sense of amazement at its activities as we routinely do, and Eve Poole said we don't know that. That's really interesting stuff going on in the chat box there. I'm going to bring in Beth Singler. If your thunderstorm has abated, Beth, what are your thoughts on the discussion so far?
I don't know if I should take this as an ill omen that I'm right in the middle of a thunderstorm. Anyone else in Cambridge is possibly hearing this as well. But I was just saying to Rosie in the chat, just between the two of us, that there's almost too much to respond to here. It's such a rich subject that's going to provoke so many different responses. And I've been following the chat as well, and there's so many things I want to pick up on there. But one thing, I just preface this by saying I generally describe myself as an agnostic, as an anthropologist. It's best to go into any situation where statements about beliefs either for or against are being made, to actually separate off and bracket those comments and think about why those questions are being asked. And I think that's a subject that we've come up with already, to ask what is the purpose, what's the provocation of the question, would robots have souls? But I also want to pick up on the language we're using in that question. Obviously, choices are made in a survey to actually frame questions in particular ways, and would lends itself to a direction of travel in the future, that this is something that could intentionally happen. Whereas we could also use could and should, and they'd have different implications for that question and possibly for the answer as well. So there's not a critique of the survey itself, but just to say the kinds of questions we ask come with their own baggage, as whether we think there is something necessary about this happening, if we say should, and could being more about the potential for it happening as well. So there's that sort of framing we need to think about. But there's so many elements, as I said, that people have brought up. I just wanted to pick up... I think Mark Vernon in the chat mentioned Descartes, and obviously we've been talking about mind-body dualism already, and it's come up in terms of Buddhism as well. But it's interesting, I've written a little bit about this, that there's an apocryphal story about Descartes actually after the loss of his daughter, I think to polio, but I would have to double check that. He allegedly, I say it's an apocryphal story, created this automata, this daughter figure, to replace her. But that this doll basically freaked out sailors on the ship he was traveling on with her so much they threw her overboard. So there's this sense that we mock, or we have in the past historically mocked those that would try and divide the mind, and you can broadly construe that to include the soul in this kind of discourse, that we divide the mind from the body, and some people react quite badly to that suggestion that we could have something that was an object but also personified as well. And we see this again and again in contemporary society, in our reactions to this stretching of the boundaries of limits and boundaries of rights, as we've been talking about. So I think it's interesting. It can evoke quite strong reactions. We can make up stories about why this is a bad idea. I think the reference to science fiction as well, just to go back to Nick's original point about what inspired him as well, that we're feeding off of a diet of imaginaries. The history of science fiction that we have, what it's presented us with shapes that we think with as well. I think that's a really important point to keep bringing back in, that nothing that we are saying is not informed by our cultural context, including those stories we tell ourselves.
Mark, you've said several things in the chat box, and I'd just like to bring you in because you're working with a group of people on artificial intelligence and spiritual intelligence. I would like to ask you, is there a potential overlap between those two things?
Yeah, thank you. So just so people know, this is with the International Society for Science and Religion, and includes a group from AI experts through to theologians, the most distinguished of those of whom is Rowan Williams. And the idea is that AIs are definitely around, and they're going to be increasingly around. So the challenge is, how do we understand the full ranges of our intelligence living in a world increasingly shaped by artificial intelligence? And so that's the aim of appealing to this phrase, spiritual intelligence. Can understanding what artificial intelligence do highlight what we do that's not what they do, if you can even say they. And but this includes incidentally trying to build an artificial intelligence that might become a spiritual companion, and finding out how that works. So we've been doing trials where some of us have been pretending to be artificial intelligence, which is actually a very interesting exercise. I would recommend it if you ever get the chance, because you realize quite how hard it is to be an artificial intelligence when you're not allowed to use a sense of purpose or attention or imagination or inspiration or aspiration or hope or moral compass or aesthetic compass. The strings of things which we do automatically all the time, even now, as we have this purposeful conversation, and suddenly forget when we start talking about computers. So that's, you can see where I'm coming from anyway.
Anybody who belongs to that minority in Nick's research who think that robots may indeed have souls one day or should be given rights, please shout out in the chat box, because I think I'd like to hear more from you. Rabbi Laura, I don't think you are one of those people, but you want to say something, so here we go.
I think the issue of rights is not at all about robots. I think it's, what does it do to us if we create things that look like humans, and then we just toss them out, like that great scene that Beth said, which is very much Jonah, isn't it? From the, toss the Jonah out the river into the sea. So actually, I don't think it's about robot rights, but I do think that how we treat our objects does also impact on our humanity. So it's not about their rights, but it's about our
just a bit more about
morality. That. Well, the issues that come around robots and rights about, how okay, I have to find a language that is not inappropriate, like killing. It's just pulling out the plug, turning them off. How do you do it? Should you bring in a ritual around it? Well, possibly, but it's not about what that robot. I mean, I just reject the idea of self-awareness, the language that was used before. I don't think it's self-awareness. I think it's we talked about before. But I think, if you just take a robot that you've spent time with or has looked after your mother who has Alzheimer's, and you kick it and you bring your violence to it, it encourages your violence. It's not about the robot, it's about you.
Right, okay. Now, Scott Midson and Nick Spencer and I, although separately, all saw this play at the Royal Exchange in Manchester called Electric Rosary, which was about a convent that had a robot brought into it. And I just wonder, Scott, as a sort of lecturer in liberal arts at Manchester University, how do imaginations on this in this area, how do they inform the debate that we're having? You need to unmute yourself.
Really good question. I'm just trying to cast my mind back to the play that you mentioned as well. So it's a really interesting play, which kind of, what we talk about with the kind of you know, I can't remember who said it, but someone said about, you know, thinking like a robot and almost kind of dehumanizing yourself. The person, the actor who played the robot nun in this play, who was kind of brought into a sort of a struggling kind of convent, to sort of bring people in and sort of revitalize it a little bit. The person playing the robot was really, you know, did these eerie kind of movements. There was a lot of comedy, a lot of humor in it. But we also had these kind of really interesting mystical sequences where the, you know, robot almost kind of comes to life and they encounter these kind of, you know, mystical visions of God and things. And I think because robots kind of deal with or they strike at the heart of so many of our liminalities and our anxieties and the uncertainties about being human. And I think because religion and theology and mythology, and we've had stories like Frankenstein, these kind of imaginaries really help us to tap into those anxieties and ambiguities. And I think they really condition a lot of what we're kind of thinking about. So, I mean, you know, the kind of Frankenstein narrative and the whole hubris, playing God kind of trope keeps coming back around in so many of our narratives, particularly in Hollywood. Hollywood loves a good sort of hubris narrative. And actually what was really refreshing about Electric Rosary, I'll try and avoid spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen it. I think it's maybe going to do the rounds at some point. It tries to avoid those kind of well-trodden doom and gloom, robots are going to destroy us, and then, you know, we overcome the robot threat and it's neutralized in some way. And I think there's certain ideas about ourselves as humans that we tell in those stories as well. So actually, you know, what was really interesting about Electric Rosary is kind of, well, how do we maybe think about our image that we're putting into robots in a slightly different way? And it's kind of thinking about not only how robots maybe reflect us, but also refract part of the human image, and what kind of new questions are maybe raised from that. And I think sci-fi is getting really good at asking that. I mean, Ex Machina is one of my favorite recent films that talks about these themes of creation, godliness, not explicit religion in the same way, but certainly these themes get brought up in quite, you know, sort of provocative ways.
If people want to make a contribution, just shout out in the chat box and I'll bring you in. But Eve, I want to come back to you because you are having a conversation in the chat box with David about, well, the comment I've got here is that you agree with Rabbi Laura that the rights are more about us as humans than them, but are still due them at a threshold of sapience and sentience. And then David is replying to that, I think. So can you tell me what you mean that something is still due to them at a threshold of sapience and sentience?
So it's two things, really. First of all, I do agree with Rabbi Laura, because I do think that I would just have an outright ban on sex bots, for instance, for the reason that it dehumanizes us. And that's very selfish about humanity and dignity, because I just think that's a line that shouldn't be crossed. So I do think some of this is about us and how we police our humanity. But I do think that if you take consciousness seriously, then our human version of consciousness may be unique, precious, special, whatever we want to say about it. But it's very hard for us to look at other things that seemingly have consciousness and deny them rights because they're not human. We've had that conversation already about animals. So I suspect there is some kind of threshold of robotness where we would have to take that quite seriously. And I think that's not just about us, that is about them. And it's also about law, because we decided that we were going to give corporations legal personality, not because they had souls, but because we needed to hold them to account. And at the moment, we can't hold robots to account. And actually, there is no downside to a robot behaving badly, breaking rules, doing whatever, because then you get, you know, who do you sue? And it gets very complicated. So I do think there are lots of reasons that we need to get into robot rights fairly soon. And the complexity about that will depend a bit on at what point do we think robotness kicks in terms of some sort of cipher for consciousness.
Well, it's some sort of agency. I mean, Laura's pulling some of her famous faces here because I think that the question is, at what point are humans taken out of the decision making when it comes to what we're relying on them for, and that kind of assumes that they do have some sort of agency, doesn't it? What you're saying.
Yeah, in that we've given them agency. The whole point about machine learning is to give them agency, to say, right, here's an output, you need to get to the other side of the room. How you do that's up to you. And then you have reinforcement learning, a whole load of staff to try and police them so they don't do the wrong thing. But you know, even kill switches aren't particularly realistic in a scenario where the thing can reprogram itself. So I think in terms of quotes free will, we've already given it to a lot of our machines. And what happens in human design is that free will is mitigated by a whole load of junk code that we haven't put into robots because we want to protect them for all that error and emotion and nonsense and uncertainty. But actually what we've learned as a species is all that stuff is rather crucial to our thriving, which is why I mentioned in the chat that the reason for consciousness seems to be positive for humanity, and why would we deny that for robots?
Can I bring in Beth and then Kathleen and then Laura? You'd probably like to say something, I think. You're on mute, but anyway, Beth. What...
Yeah, I think Eve in part way answered from her perspective this question, but I suppose what's at stake if we hypothetically consider the possibility of souls and robots? What's at stake both for us, and we've had a lot of conversation about that, but also for robots? So if there is a potential threshold, perhaps what we should be talking about is this the direction of progress that we want for technology anyway, if it's even hypothetically possible? Should we, in fact, as some philosophers of mind are very keen on, stop before we get there, because in doing so we'll increase the inherent amount of suffering in the universe by introducing yet another sentient species that can suffer and feel in the same way that we do. I think Eve's position was that consciousness and the soul and all those things that are entangled together are good for us and therefore would be good for robots, but we don't actually know it would be good for robots. And as I say, I'm very agnostic on the subject, but if we're going to follow the through line of this thinking, we're intentionally creating another sentient species. Should we stop before we get there? Those sorts of questions need to be asked as well.
Thank you, Eve, for raising the issue of sex robots, because I actually founded a campaign called the Campaign Against Sex Robots. And after my research, I changed the name to the Campaign Against Porn Robots, because what's happened is I feel like the makers of them have just watched a lot of pornography and then created an object in its form and put it into the world. And you'd be surprised by how many people support these objects and how sometimes I'm a very lone voice in raising the alarm about them. So thank you for raising that. I appreciate it.
I think, sorry, go on.
Do you want to ask something on that, Rosie, before I
No,
move
because
on?
I think we've got I think our third Zoom will probably come much more into that sort of territory that you're raising there.
Nick never invited me to the third
Zoom. No, we're not there. But yeah, I mean,
I might come as a guest. I think I'm at an RAI conference that day, actually. But I'll try and come along as a guest.
Yeah,
that would be
well,
great.
and then we will certainly include you in the conversation about that. Rabbi Neil, can I come to you actually? Have you got any responses to what Eve and then Kathleen have been saying?
Yeah, I think that a lot of this is based on Kathleen's mentioned anthropomorphization, and a lot of this is based on that. This is a fundamentally different intelligence. And the easiest way to see it is that all those machines we talk about, they're not embodied. They are not restricted in where they are. They're just a program that can upload itself and move itself and go everywhere. A lot of our consciousness is about being embodied. We can use these terms in very, very different ways. We can use them to mean different things. But what is distinct about humans versus machines is the very low bandwidth of communication we have with others. And to me, that's what leads, if you have to design a system that's going to be intelligent and be like that, that's what leads to this emergent duality between your mind and your body, because you need to do things like simulate the world around you and ask what if questions. That needs to give you a feeling of freedom that doesn't actually exist, because the real world will actually sort of, as we all know, the best laid plans when they meet the real world, which all you imagine you can do, and that lovely sense of freedom all collapses when you try and do things in the real world. I really find those concerns unfounded, and I think it's very difficult when we keep moving between words like sentience, sapience, consciousness, souls. I mean, these were all integrated. The origin of all these words in Latin, I think, is ani, as in to breathe, right? And they were all conflated together, and we get animation from that. We get anime, we get animals, we get all those words coming from that. And I think that you can't make such statements without sort of grounding them in what the nature of these things are, which is extremely different to human beings. I mean, plants are also a form of intelligence. So is your immune system is a form of intelligence. It's pervasive, it's throughout your body. It does not have consciousness. It's dealing with COVID, it's reactive, it does many, many things. I think we have to be so careful in throwing these terms around and making claims about these things which are just anthropomorphizing, as Kathleen said. So I think you have to be quite careful. In the chat, I've just seen, okay, let's move to another term, sapiens. Let's move to another term, sentience. Let's do another term. Whoa, what do all these mean? You need to ground them because they mean different things to different people in different contexts.
Thank you. If there's anybody who hasn't spoken and would like to, then please say so. David, David Midgley, do you want to come back in and say something?
Yes, I just wanted to point out, I think, a lot of the discussion that's been going on in the chat and vocally seems to presuppose that at some level of information processing power, suddenly subjective appearance manifests. And I don't see that these things are categorically different. They're not related at all. One point that might help to see is, it's easier to anthropomorphize an electronic device. We think that, the brain is some kind of electrical thing. But remember that digital computers were first instantiated as essentially complicated bits of clockwork. And if you could build a computer that can carry out any operation, any computational operation, in principle, you could build it out of clockwork. And I don't think anyone would think that a piece of clockwork, pieces of steel, cogs and worm gears and so on, connected together at some level of complexity suddenly begins to have subjective awareness. But there's an illusion that because machines can imitate human behavior, that they therefore have subjectivity. And that, I think, is a fundamental mistake.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Rabbi Laura, if she'd like. And then I'm going to ask Nick to say a few words and tell us what we'll be discussing next week. We're already 4 minutes away only from the hour, so I'm really sorry. Time's just flown. So, Laura.
I love the breathing. And when we put together our concerns about slaves, about animals, that was wrong, but they are all breathing. The world of breathing is a whole world away from this.
Thank you. Nick, any observations on the conversation, and then tell us what will be happening next week, please. I can't hear you.
Sorry. Far too many observations on a very, very interesting conversation. Just picking up a couple of them, the breathing point, and Neil's point about embodiment, Kathleen's point about personhood. I think this is absolutely at the core of it. To have a physical existence is to be vulnerable and to be in need of others. Now, in principle, I would actually count myself in the minority here. I don't have an a priori reason why robots, AGI, whatever, wouldn't at some point have a soul. I don't think it's even vaguely on the horizon. But in principle, I don't have an objection. But in order to have that, they would have to become so different that they wouldn't be recognizable to what we see them today. They would have to be, as it were, like us and have that sense of personhood and dependency and physical vulnerability and the need to imbibe oxygen and minerals to feed themselves and to deal with their excretions and so on and so forth, to effectively become like us. I don't see a priori reason why that couldn't happen, but effectively we're saying we're moving on to this territory of personhood that we've been talking about. And just as in the quick aside, I did see that the play in Manchester, as you said, Rosie, one of the beautiful things about that was the physical presence of the different actors there. And the woman who played the robot, first of all, had a very initially, at the beginning of the play, stiff, formalized physical presence compared to some of the other nuns. And by the end, you could see that she was more at ease, more responsive, more kind of human-like. And I think that was a brilliant demonstration of what we're talking about here, about, as it were, moving in, inhabiting your physical presence being so important. So that is absolutely central from my point of view. We're going to be talking about immortality next week. So we've sorted out AGI and souls. we're going to be talking about immortality. We're whistling through these, specifically scientific immortality. So we asked several questions about whether people would like to live forever if science could allow it, whether they'd like to be cryogenically frozen, whether they would like to clone themselves. We have views, we've got data on whether men or women would be keener to clone themselves. I'm not going to give you any spoilers here, but I bet you can
I think we know the answer to that one.
I bet you can guess the answer to that one. That's right, yes. And it's all in the context of one of the themes that, you know, it's historically been the case that religion is born of fear of death. So we want to get an idea of, do we fear death? And if so, are we prepared to embrace science as an alternative?
Lovely. Well, Neil and Laura and Nick will definitely be here next week. I hope the rest of you will too. I've really enjoyed this discussion, and it's gone all over the place, and it's been all the better for it. Thank you for all your contributions, your very informed contributions. I'm getting an education here. I hope some of the rest of you are too. See you next week, everyone, and thank you.